The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio, published between 1348 and 1353, this book is a collection of 100 short stories told by 6 women and 3 men as they decide to retreat to the Italian countryside to get away from the Black Death. It's also known as the human comedy, in contrast to Dante's The Divine Comedy, and Boccaccio himself was the one to give Dante's comedy the epithet divine. And this is sort of seen as a response in that while Dante is focused very much on a spiritual journey, Boccaccio is instead focusing on the much messier and often much funnier human life. I have to say that I have had this on my Audible list for a long time, and I've always been a bit apprehensive about it. I tend to struggle when it comes to short story collections compared to novels. It's not that I don't like short stories or think that they're bad or anything. I just struggle to connect with short stories in the way that I do connect with novels. I think primarily it's just because short stories are short, you have much less time with the characters, and so while I tend to appreciate short stories, it tends to be more like I might appreciate a nice little idea or a little bit of something. It doesn't quite have the substance that novels have for me. Nevertheless, I was really blown away by this collection, and it might actually be one of the best things I've read ever, if not this year for sure. I was impressed by the range of stories here, which range from stories of heroes, villains, bawdy stories, borderline lewd stories, hilarious stories, serious stories, sad stories. Pretty much every single dimension to human life you could think of, you find in at least one of these 100 stories, and that's a pretty impressive feat. And the fact that Boccaccio is able to entertain throughout this collection of short stories, I didn't really feel bogged down or bored, it never felt like a chore to read, was really impressive, and as I say, not what I was expecting at all. I'm going to do a second video on the Decameron where I pick the 10 best stories, or at least 10 great stories, one from each day, in which the characters tell the stories, and in that video I'll go into a little bit more detail on those stories. But in this video I wanted to talk more about the broader themes and ideals of this book and why it really connected with me as I was reading it. So the first thing, as I said, about the story is that it has this framing device, which I think is a very useful way for Boccaccio to anchor his stories in something. The framing device is somewhat thin in that it's just these 6 ladies and 3 gentlemen who go away to the countryside, and then they decide to tell these stories. Every day one of them is elected king or queen of the party, and usually they will set a theme for the storytelling. So some of the themes include the tricks that women play on men. Another day it's just the tricks that anyone plays on anyone. Another example is stories of lovers that end tragically, or people who get out of a bad situation through a witty remark. So there are all these different kinds of framing setups throughout, and that really helps anchor the stories as well. And the characters are supposed to represent different virtues. Apparently the women are supposed to represent the 4 cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance and fortitude, and the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope and charity, while the 3 men are meant to represent the classical Greek tripartite view of the soul, reason, spirit and appetite. And I have to say I didn't really find this while I was reading them. Perhaps I'd have to reread and read the characters' specific stories to pick up on whether this was the case. Nevertheless, I did find that the characters did have enough banter between them, and in some cases a little bit of personality to pick up on some of the distinctive aspects of their storytelling. And with one of the characters in particular, Dionio, he is essentially the jester of the group, definitely representing appetite when it comes to the Greek distinction of the soul, and he often tells the last story, and he's allowed, if he wants to subvert the theme as well. And so he always ends up with a nice counterpoint to the rest of the stories, and he tells some of the most audacious and bawdy stories as well. One thing that I enjoyed about this framing device is that it helps Boccaccio embody one of his primary themes, which is his philosophy of art and literature, and why we engage in storytelling. And I was really surprised to find that he essentially has the exact same views that I do when it comes to the purpose of art, the purpose of storytelling in particular. I pretty much found his view to be exactly to the view I recently published in an academic article, which, always happens. You always find out that people often say things long before you've said them, but I appreciated the shared agreement in any case. So Boccaccio has his characters taking themselves out of the very bleak real-life situation of the Black Death, and he takes them away to tell these stories. And some of these stories are actually quite shocking. They're not Sard levels of disgusting and depraved. They're not vulgar by any stretch, but they're certainly bawdy and sometimes a bit lewd. But Boccaccio has enough wit to carry them off and to make them more fun and light than someone like Sard, who's a bit more visceral and grim. And he even has his characters laughing at some pretty immoral happenings, especially on the day when they're telling stories about the tricks that women play on men. Sometimes the men deserve it, other times the men really don't deserve it. There's one story where a woman, just because she wants to cheat on her husband, just gets him drunk all the time and makes him into an alcoholic so that she can do this. And then when he works out that she's trying to do this, he tries to get back at her and catch her in the act, and she manages to outwit him, and eventually he's castigated as the real drunk, and she gets away with it. And you might think on the surface level this is terrible, that you have these characters who are not only telling quite crass and disturbing stories, but they're praising immoral characters. And Boccaccio addresses this at the end of his story in a bit of a speech justifying why he had his characters do this. And he points out something that I broadly agree with, which is this idea that when it comes to storytelling, this is an act of play, and so we shouldn't really apply the rules of normal life when we're engaging in storytelling. And by having his characters embody these themes of virtue, and at the beginning of the story having the women in particular, when they're going away, they recognize that it would be good to have men there, but also they worry about potentially causing a scandal if they're just running into the countryside with some strange men. And so they have when it comes to what they're doing in real life, they are very much embedded in spiritual practices. They take days off to respect the holy days. They're virtuous men and women. But when it comes to their play, they step outside of that and just have a good time. And that really is my philosophy of storytelling and art, that it is something separate, that it is a form of play, and that when it comes to getting morals from stories, or immoral from stories as well, I suppose, that's ultimately about you and what you choose to take from a story. If you are a terrible person, then you might read something like Oliver Twist and think that Oliver is just a loser who should have stayed in the factory and you have no sympathy for him. Whereas if you're someone who's quite compassionate, you might have a lot of sympathy for Oliver Twist. Obviously, Dickens might want you to have sympathy, but that's a very different thing from whether or not you do respond in that way. And Boccaccio essentially lives up to this, not just by the end of the collection when he expressly says, whether or not you become a better person from art and telling stories is ultimately about you. But also, he lives up to that in the way that he crafts this story by having his characters be morally upstanding people and yet taking them out of the concerns of ordinary life by going away, retreating from the grim reality of the Black Death, and then they're just having fun telling these stories. And it's just a really nice way to express that more philosophical point about the purpose of storytelling. And I think that's why I really resonated with this book, just because it's something that as I said, I broadly agree with this view. So it was nice to see that lived through the story, as much as also Boccaccio's own points at the end there. As I said, some of these tales are very audacious and over the top. There's some great stories of people not just playing tricks on their lovers, but having affairs in some very bizarre situations. And this is also something that Boccaccio takes flack for. In fact, some of the translations of some of the stories, when they were first done in English, they actually didn't translate those parts of the book because it was too much. And so there were bits that were censored. So even in his time, he was seen as maybe going a bit too far. And there's a part of his book as well where he justifies not only the fact that he tells these bawdy tales, but that he has women not only telling these stories sometimes, but laughing along. These are the sorts of stories that you would really expect men to be telling around a campfire with just other men. And you have these women who enjoy the stories, laugh along with them, and even come up with them. And a big theme of the Decameron is this idea that women can just be as sexually driven as men, as bawdy as men, and all of that. And it's something that he addresses again directly to the reader. I think at the end of the fourth day, he considers this, and he considers the objection that he's sort of corrupting women and being a bit of a pervert to be so obsessed with women. Because another thing that he does is he often, when he addresses his reader, he addresses them as ladies. So he's presuming that his readers are women as well, which obviously, given the nature of some of these stories, the more puritanical people in his society would see that as problematic. And so he tells this little story to justify his love of women, which is an amusing little story of a boy whose father keeps him away from women. This boy never sees a woman in his entire life, and then he sees a group of them and immediately becomes infatuated, and his dad tries to say, oh, they're just geese or something. I can't remember what the bird is. I think it's geese. And the boy's like, can I have one, please? And the story ends there. It ends deliberately in an abrupt way. But it's Boccaccio basically saying that it is perfectly natural for a man to be attracted to women, and that's why he presents them in this way, and that's why he also focuses as much on the beauty of women, but also on the sexual side of women as well. He sees women as fully realized creatures who do have, obviously, virtue and goodness, but they also have a sexual side that a lot of fiction typically represses, typically portraying women as sort of virginal and not very interested in sex. That's more of a male thing. And Boccaccio really subverts that whole idea. And a lot of his stories do involve women who have sexual appetites that are equivalent to, and sometimes even outmatch, the men in their lives. But ultimately, what I enjoyed most about the Decameron, it wasn't just that I share its philosophical views and I found the stories entertaining. I just like that it's just a complete celebration of pretty much humanity in all of its messiness. Boccaccio, as I said, he's not a moralist, but he's also not a immoral writer in the way that someone like Sard is. He's not morbidly obsessed with the dark sides of humanity. He's somewhere in the middle of that. He respects things like tradition and religion to a point, but his works often feature, members of these organizations that are corrupt and hypocritical, and they never live up to their principles. And then he looks at how women are treated differently from men when it comes to things like sex and romance. And so he looks at all of these various messy aspects of human life, and he pretty much gives everyone a colouring from light to dark. There are corrupt friars, but there are also morally upstanding friars in the stories as well. There are good women and bad women, and the same applies to men. And that's pretty impressive that he can be so comprehensive in his storytelling. It's quite rare to find that, even in something like a short story collection. Often they might be unified by a particular theme or motif or idea, and so they come across as being really just from one perspective. But with the Decameron, I think Boccaccio does a really good job of exploring lots of different dimensions to human beings, their personalities and differences. And that's really impressive. I'm looking forward to reading this again, as I say, and maybe reading them rather than reading them just chronologically as I did, maybe picking different characters and then reading their stories to see if I can unpack anything deeper there. If there really is a sign that some of these characters do seem to embody certain virtues, that would be an interesting dimension. As I said, I didn't fully feel that with a lot of the stories, except for Dionio, because it's obvious he has a very strong personality that comes through. Nevertheless, I think that there's certainly something to reading them in that way, and this is certainly a text that I'll be reading again and again. But if you do read this, I would definitely recommend taking Boccaccio's own advice when it comes to engaging with these stories. Engaging with art is fundamentally about play and leisure, not sermonizing or revealing the truth to people. Instead, when you read these stories, of course you can find truths in these things, as I say, things about how men and women maybe are, hypocrisy in the church, all of that kind of stuff, but that's not really the main thing that you should be doing when you engage with these works. You should just be enjoying your leisure time, enjoying the escapism of the stories, enjoying the wit of the characters, even if some of them do some nefarious things. And I think you'll find that if you engage in the story in that way, you'll find your leisure much more satisfying than if you're sort of going through this looking for things that you can sort of cross out as problematic with a red pen. The fundamental point really is just to spend some time away from all of the things that we worry about in ordinary life and to enjoy the free play found in leisure and storytelling. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know down in the comments if you've read the Decameron, what did you think of it? As I said, I'm going to be doing another video where I go through 10 of my favourite stories, picking the best story from each of the 10 days, and I'm looking forward to getting into that. But if you want to highlight some of your favourite stories from the Decameron in the comments, feel free to do that below. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.